Welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us tonight at this event that is co-sponsored by both the Non-Academic Staff Association and the Association of Academic Staff at the University of Alberta. We're thrilled to have you all with us and are looking forward to an informative discussion and information from our friends in Australia and some Q&A afterwards. A few housekeeping things just to get started here. First of all is that we have simultaneous ASL interpretation for this event. We will make sure to try and speak slowly enough so that these folks can interpret it. The name on the interpretation says interpreter, so you should be able to highlight that box and pin the video to your screen. As always on Zoom, we ask you to please mute yourself if you are not speaking so we don't have any feedback. And we will try and make sure that we create a little bit of space here when our interpreters are switching back and forth between each other so folks can find the new interpreter video as it comes up. If you have any questions or technical difficulties during the webinar, please don't be afraid to reach out to the box marked NASA, to the participant marked NASA, and Cole can help you navigate any technical difficulties. I'd like to begin our event by respectfully acknowledging that the University of Alberta and the offices of NASA and AASUA are located on Treaty 6 territory in Amisquitchie Waskahigan, which means Beaver Hills House, in the language of the Plains Cree. It's a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Papas Chase, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our community today. This land has always been a gathering place, and today we gather virtually to respectfully share knowledge, learn from one another, and celebrate the millennia of learning that have occurred in this place. It's important to acknowledge this place because we're all bound to this treaty. We are all responsible for upholding its promises and commitments, and for calling out and challenging those who would see its word and spirit broken and violated. I would also like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land on which our Australian colleagues are located, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. We pay our respects to those who have cared and continue to care for country and whose land was never ceded, given up, bought, or sold. I would like to just do a brief recap of how it is that we got here and why we're here today. And then I will hand over to NASA President Elizabeth Johansson to introduce our guests. Since October 2019, the University of Alberta has received $110 million in cuts at the hands of Jason Kenney's UCP government and will receive further cuts of $53 million in each of the next 2 years, totaling a cut of $216 million, or 33% of the U of A's Government of Alberta campus grant over 4 years. The government's current financial situation makes it likely that even deeper cuts will be announced in February when they announce their next provincial budget. In the spring, then U of A President Turpin announced that the immediate effect of the cuts would be the elimination of 1,000 positions by the end of the 2020-2021 academic year. Shortly thereafter, incoming President Bill Flanagan announced that the U of A would embark on a major academic and administrative restructuring that would reduce the number of faculties, increase administrative efficiency, and ultimately save the university $120 million per year. The process would be led by two high-level working groups, the Academic Restructuring Working Group and the Service Excellent Transformation Steering Committee. The roadmap for the restructure, we were told, would be provided by Australian consulting firm Nous Group, and the model for the restructure would be the University of Sydney. Given that neither AASUA or NASA were given participation on the working groups, and we were refused access to any of the advice, benchmark data, or financial information that formed the basis of the plans and financial projections, we decided to seek out an alternative source of information. With tremendous assistance from Carolyn Sale, we were able to connect directly with union colleagues from the University of Sydney who would tell us exactly what their restructuring process meant for teaching, research, and student services at the school, and what it meant for academic and administrative workers on the front lines at the University of Sydney. The restructuring at the University of Sydney, which was developed and carried out over a number of years, also came in response to brutal austerity and defunding of the post-secondary sector by the Australian government. Today, those austerity programs continue, and the country's universities continue to feel the effects. The government has announced plans to double the tuition price of arts, communications, and humanities degrees. Universities are shutting down entire programs to deal with the cuts and tuition increases, and the University of Sydney is now calling for voluntary redundancies. At the same time, they have seen a steep decline in education standards, increased class sizes, and significant cuts to staff and resources. Our provincial government has shown its willingness to engage in the same kind of austerity and implement the same kind of ideological priorities across the system. At the same time, the consulting group advising the U of A on these changes is the same one that orchestrated the implementation of cuts and restructuring at universities across Australia, the Nous Group. So here we are to learn about what's happening at USydney, what we can expect here, and perhaps importantly, get some tips on how we can fight back. I'll now hand over to Elizabeth to introduce our guests and facilitate the session from here. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Ricardo. And many, many thanks to our friends from the University of Sydney for taking the time to be with us today. I think that a lot of us are really curious, and obviously there's quite a bit of interest in hearing your perspectives on what's happened in Sydney. So our two guests today are Nick Riemer, who is a senior lecturer in the English and Linguistics Department at the University of Sydney, and a long-term member of the branch committee of the National Tertiary Education Union at the university. Nick has been working at the University of Sydney since 2005 and has chaired the NTEU campaign committee, which plans and carries out campaign actions, edited the branch counter report into the university, organized strikes, and participated across the whole gamut of union activities. And our second guest is Alma Torlakovic, who has been an active member of the NTEU at the University of Sydney for 10 years. She is an elected member of the local branch's leadership body, the branch committee, as well as a national councillor. She has led several campaigns to save jobs and working conditions, including the 2013 strike campaign when the union took 7 days of strike. She is also a leading member of NTEU Fight Back, a newly formed rank and file caucus of union members campaigning against concessionary bargaining. So we all want to welcome you, Alma and Nick, and they're each going to be speaking to us for a short time, and then we will be going to a question and answer. And when we get to the question and answer, we're going to ask for people to type their questions into the chat box. So I am going to hand the floor over to Nick to start things off and give us some of his information and perspectives.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, even if the circumstances that lead us to be here together are so grim, whether that's in Alberta or in Sydney. And I'd like to start by acknowledging that I'm speaking from stolen Gadigal land, as Ricardo has already indicated. And I think the first thing that I want to just say to everybody here is to just express my solidarity to you. 1,000 jobs threatened at a university is a very significant attack. And I can only imagine the anxiety and the outrage that's inducing at the moment. And so I'd just like to, as I say, express my full solidarity to you and convey the message that, you know, here at the University of Sydney, we have quite a strong branch of the National Tertiary Education Union that is committed to doing what we can in a spirit of internationalism and in a spirit that recognises the importance of education to everyone, regardless of where they are in the world. So we have a union here that is committed to standing in solidarity with colleagues around the world everywhere who are facing the same kind of managerial neoliberal attacks. So I was asked to talk really about three things. The university's academic reputation before and after the restructuring, the political reality of unions in Australia, and the union response that was made to the kinds of attacks that we went through and are still going through. And I'll address those things in order, and the thing I'll have most to say about is the way that our union typically responds to these kinds of management proposals, because I think perhaps the first thing to say is that the restructure that you're undergoing at Alberta and that was modelled on the version at Sydney, for us was really just one iteration of what is effectively a rolling set of restructures and managerial incursions which have never relented since the first moment that I've been a staff member at the University of Sydney. This is something that our union has consistently highlighted and tried to campaign against. And I think you'd be hard placed to find any of my colleagues at the University of Sydney who didn't acknowledge that we are in an environment which is characterised by permanent management realignment of the basic parameters of our work. So we're continually facing restructures. The goalposts are continually shifting, and that leads to a general climate, I think, of uncertainty, anxiety, precarity, because no one ever has the confidence that they can take the institutional structure that they work in for granted, and that there's some fair chance that that is going to provide a sort of ongoing, durable context for their work at the university. Everybody's position, to a greater or lesser extent, is always under threat. The organizational arrangements that really make our work possible are always up for grabs. So I have the impression, talking to Elizabeth and Ricardo and Cole, that the restructure that you're facing is perhaps not part of such a permanent and ongoing set of management moves to destabilise the workplace. Ours certainly was, and we dealt with it in those terms. So the first thing that I was really asked to talk about was academic restructuring before, academic reputation before and after the restructure. And look, I think that the thing that I'd like to say is perhaps not very useful to you, which is that I think that among the constituencies that university managers care about, the university's reputation has not been adversely affected at all, and perhaps quite the contrary. So on all of the measures that we are used to talking about within the contemporary corporate university, I don't think the University of Sydney's position has been affected by the 2015, 16, 17 restructures in any significant way. I think we have largely held our position in international rankings, if you care about them. Our international student flows have been maintained and consolidated. I'm speaking about the pre-pandemic environment particularly. And our university management, particularly our Vice-Chancellor, Michael Spence, who came to us about 10 years ago from a less senior position at Oxford in the UK, and is now at the end of this year moving on to a much more senior position at University College London. His reputation clearly has not been affected adversely by any of the depredations that he's been responsible for at the university. So among the indices that management care about, this restructure has been, I think, a positive thing for them probably. Among staff, it has certainly just contributed to the sense that's very strong in everyone already, that we have a management that is deeply disengaged from the daily realities of teaching and conducting research and doing administration in a university. But there's a sense in which that doesn't really matter, at least for management. It doesn't really matter. I mean, it's a management have an enormous amount of power and control over the university workforce, given the scarcity of academic jobs, and now in the post-COVID environment with the downturn of the Australian economy, professional staff jobs as well, to the extent that any of them are available. And management don't really need to worry very much about their reputation among university staff generally in the community, except insofar as that impacts on their own staff's ability to challenge them on the campus industrially through the National Tertiary Education Union, and I'll come to that in a moment. But before I talk specifically about the actions that we have taken to fight back against management austerity measures, maybe I'll say something about our union, and Alma, when she comes to speak, can nuance that and supplement it by anything that she thinks is important. So first, perhaps some just brief context on the University of Sydney itself. So we're a large, comprehensive university. We're the oldest university in Australia for whatever that's worth, founded around 1850. We have about 8,000 ongoing or fixed term staff. So that is staff who have open-ended contracts or staff who are appointed for a number of years, usually, I think about 3. And then we have many, many thousands more non-ongoing, casually appointed staff who work under disgracefully precarious conditions from one semester to the next. Our membership in the National Tertiary Education Union branch is high for Australian university standards, but objectively low. At the very best, we would only have coverage of something like 25% at the very best of academic staff. And there are different ways, of academic and administrative staff. There are different ways of calculating that. The real density might be more like, 20% or even a bit less than that. The way that we calculate that is complicated, depending on whether you go on the total number of full-time equivalent positions or a head count. So we are, what is certain though, is that our union is in an absolute minority position on campus in terms of membership. We're also constrained by some of the most highly repressive union laws in the so-called developed world. Australia has laws that massively restrict unions' right to organise and to, in particular, take strike action. We're limited to striking to the periods of renegotiation of our collective agreements, which happen only roughly every 4 years. And even then, we have to jump through highly bureaucratic and restrictive hoops, which have been set up to, to tie our hands, essentially. And I belong actually to a national organisation of union members, which has been recently formed, the National Higher Education Action Network, which is trying to promote the politics and the idea of an illegal strike in Australian universities. That we're in early days for that at the moment. Excuse me if I take the occasional gulp of coffee here. Okay, so, what I've said so far, I suppose, is that we're operating in a politically hostile environment for many reasons. The laws are set up to tie our hands, and the sort of ideological parameters that are taken seriously as measures of the university's performance things like university ranking, student numbers. They are international ability to market the university to international students. These are set up in a way that accept the same kind of neoliberal premises that also lead to job cuts and austerity measures more widely. So the deck is stacked against us. So what do we do about that? Well, as I've said, we have faced a rolling series of restructures, really forever, essentially. We have a managerial cadre at the university that is deeply cut off from the realities of education, research, or administration, and really run the university as a set of personal fiefdoms. The governance structure of the university has recently been evacuated of most of the vestiges of democratic staff participation that existed. So we have really at the most senior level of the university, at the level of the University Senate, which is the body that is most that makes the most important financial decisions about what the university is going to do. There is a very, very small minority of student and staff representation. There are no elected positions in academic governance. So deans, for example, are not elected. So we have really been the objects, as many parts of Western academia have, although not all, Anglophone academia particularly, we've been the objects of a real massive step backwards, I think, in terms of the kinds of values of participation, democracy, collegiality that many of us are still committed to. But of course, if in reality those values have been entirely trampled underfoot, they're well and truly alive ideologically. And many of our colleagues still, I think, buy the lie that university administrations are only too happy to fuel that we do operate in an environment that is fundamentally collegial, one that fundamentally operates on consensus. And that's an ideological obstacle that the union has to make a lot of efforts to overcome. So instilling in our members the reality that the university is not a collegial environment, that the force of reason or the force of argument is usually not enough to win battles when staff come into conflict with the administration. These are things that we have to do a lot of political work to win arguments about among our own members. How do we do that? Well, I intend to speak for about 3 more minutes. Is that okay, Ricardo and Elizabeth and Cole? Okay. So when we find ourselves coming into conflict with university management, our initial instinct is to demonstrate against it. So the union branch at the University of Sydney spends a lot of its time calling on-campus demonstrations of staff members outside the administration building, where we stand with flags, we make speeches, we sometimes march to the Vice-Chancellor's study in the main quadrangle. And that, I think, seems ridiculous to people who are committed to the idea of an institution that is predicated on a certain kind of deliberative democracy in its decision-making processes. But that kind of militancy and that kind of overt manifestation of opposition to university plans, I think, is absolutely central to our political strategy on campus, because it rallies student support and it sends a message of determination and a willingness to step outside the officially mandated processes of negotiation that are stacked in the university management's favour, and that on their own will very rarely deliver us the kinds of outcomes for our members that we need. Having said that, we do use those mechanisms entirely. So at the moment, we're facing a voluntary redundancy campaign at the university, which in all likelihood is going to be a curtain raiser to use our Vice-Chancellor's term, for a more sweeping series of job cuts prompted by the downturn that we've seen in the COVID environment. So we are doing all of those things. We're contesting these things using the legal processes that are available to us. We are calling large all-staff meetings held online at the moment to present a counter narrative to undermine the financial case that the university management is putting forward for this program. We're writing emails to all staff members at the university, whether they're a union member or not. We're recording videos, which we're asking our members to send to their students, explaining why students should oppose this restructure and asking students to campaign with us. In the first instance, by writing to the Vice-Chancellor. In the second instance, by participating in on-campus activities. There have been lots of student demonstrations on campus, many of them actually severely repressed by the police, I'm sorry to say. And that activity is all continuing. So yeah, as someone's just said in the chat, we have a highly engaged membership for some of the membership. We have a very large disengaged membership, but what I think I can say is that when in this kind of situation, the union does have a sort of ideological hegemony, I would say, on campus, just because management make mistakes, management have a vision of the university which is counterposed to the vision of most staff. So in that sense, our job is easy for us. Management is not popular. It's easy to challenge them. Our job is to make it easier our job is to build up rank and file members and non-members' confidence in challenging them. And I'll just end by saying that there is no downside to organising on campus. That's, I think, an important message that everybody needs to understand. There is no downside to resistance. Most people, I think, are held back by fear of management reprisal. In my experience, this is far more feared than real. And the more that it's possible to cultivate a collective sense of opposition, a collective consciousness as members of the union first, and as employees of the union second, employees of the university second, in the belief that it is the union which expresses the true educational, pedagogic and civic ideals that got us into the university in the first place. That's the kind of consciousness that we try to cultivate, and that develops with every little action that we take publicly on campus, no matter how trivial, no matter how ineffectual it seems. These things have ripples and they just build. So I just encourage everybody to not be backward in first delaying the change structure that you're going through. And while you delay it legally, if you can, taking every opportunity you can to demonstrate against it publicly. Thanks very much. Sorry to have gone on a bit long.
Thank you so much, Nick. I think you've given us a lot to think about already, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what Alma has to add to your comments. So we'll send it over to you, Alma.
Thank you, comrades. Alma Torlakovic here, speaking to you from stolen Parable land in Sydney. I'm usually on stolen Gadigal land. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and reiterate that it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I start timing myself as well. I'll try to slow down with my speech. Sorry, I have a tendency to talk very fast. So again, firstly, congratulations for a massive union meeting. This is amazing. Over 300 people on an afternoon session. We usually have our union meetings in the middle of the day at lunchtime. So it's very impressive to have over 300 people in the afternoon. Yeah, solidarity with comrades facing job losses as well. I know it's a terrifying time. I know that it feels like we can't necessarily win every battle, but as Nick said, it's important to fight. There is nothing more important to do, really. I wanted to give a bit of context about the higher education sector, which I think helps understand the plans that Sydney University has, you know, rolled out for the last decade or so. So I guess it's fairly obvious to most people that higher education is becoming corporatized and already is so in most places, Sydney being no exception. In Australia, higher education has been the third largest export for some time. So it is a very lucrative multi-billion-dollar market. This has had an impact on how universities run. Essentially, the bosses have wanted to turn universities into degree factories. So how can they facilitate lots of international students coming in, paying very high fees, graduating as quickly as possible, and then moving on so that they can push through the next batch? That's essentially been the trend with higher education. Now, at the moment, we have obviously a big crisis on our hands because of this, the over-reliance on this model, because as in the last few decades, the government funding has decreased, and universities have started to rely on international student funding as a way to fill that funding gap. And now we find ourselves in a situation where with declining student enrollments, all of a sudden universities are saying they're broke. And we have a big campaign going on, as Nick alluded to, in the National Tertiary Education Union to save jobs. And we have already lost hundreds and hundreds of jobs at Sydney University alone, but thousands across the sector. So that's the context of higher ed right now. In terms of the context of the union itself, so Nick is right to say that our density is high for university standards across Australia. So we have, close to 25% density at Sydney Uni, but it is low if you think about it, because it really, what we should be having is 100% density, or at least over 90%. But it's also not just about, organizational weakness. There is a bit of, to say the least, political weakness in most unions in Australia, unfortunately, and it does come from the idea that unions are there not necessarily to fight for members, or not necessarily to, create a crisis for management or create fights and organize members around a fight, but actually to sort of collaborate with management or be a partner in business. And so I think this kind of political weakness has, had a detrimental impact on organizing in the higher education sector. However, there are, in the union, there are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people across the country who want to reclaim the true tradition of unionism, and that is that it's not about business unionism, but it is about those true old values of, number one, the boss is not your friend. We're not here to help the university corporatize and be more efficient, etc. So I would summarize that kind of political problem as concessionary bargaining. And as I mentioned in my bio, I'm part of a rank and file caucus called NTU Fight Back that is campaigning against concessionary bargaining. So that is the context for, very brief context for the union and for higher ed. Just moving on to the actual restructure at Sydney University. So I'm a professional staff member. I've been working at the university for about 10 years in postgraduate administration services. So that is essentially like the student center, or, administration support in terms of enrollments, graduations, etc. for postgrad research students. So PhD and Master of Philosophy type students. The main things that I want to focus on are the impact that centralization has had on us. So in terms of staff, in terms of students, and in terms of the services, and just to draw out some key kind of things from that. So I guess the first thing is centralization. What has it actually meant for us? So prior to Sydney Uni rolling out its various restructures, and like Nick is right to say that for us, it happened over several years, not in one big go. I just don't know how they plan to do it at the University of Alberta. It just seems crazy. But ours happened over a long period of time. And the main things they did was centralizing basically student support services that would previously sit in faculties. And if you were a student support officer in a faculty, for example, Faculty of Engineering or Faculty of Arts or Faculty of Pharmacy, often what would happen is your job would be very interesting and varied. So you would be responsible for a number of tasks to provide student support. So that would go from enrollment to providing course advice to issuing offers of course offers to helping graduations, etc. And then on top of that, you would service committees. You would basically provide pastoral care for students. So in short, your role would be very mixed and varied and interesting. With the centralization, what management did, and this is a trend that they do essentially in every single industry, is they reorganize production around tasks. So, for example, if 10% of your job in the faculty was doing enrollments, they would take your role they would take away that task away from you and put it into a central unit and organize that unit around that specific work task. So this allows management to have a better overview of what is going on with the work. And obviously they're not doing it because they want to create a better service for students or create efficiencies or whatever. They do it so they can have a greater control over the workforce, and they can strip away parts of your job and essentially make it easier to de-skill the workforce. So take away responsibilities, concentrate all the knowledge into middle management type layers, and then justify paying people less. That's sort of the trend. This didn't necessarily happen to every single professional staff member at the university. So I don't want to sound like we, lost everything. We didn't. And there has been a positive outcome as well to centralization, which I'll get to in a minute when we talk about resistance. But just to explain that this, reorganization of work, which essentially is called Taylorism, breaking up work processes into simplified tasks, has been a major feature of the Sydney Uni restructure. Cool. I hope I'm not talking too fast. Just let me know if I'm talking too fast. Yeah. So how did that look like in the student center? So what happened was we had all sorts of student support services happening in the faculties. They merged the faculties into smaller groups and then centralized the services into work units. And firstly, how did they do this to staff? So I'm not sure if this is the plan for University of Alberta, but they did this at Sydney Uni, which is, we call it spill and fill. So the spill is they sack everybody. So they make the whole workforce redundant in that unit. They create a new organizational structure, and in the new organizational structure, the jobs are different in the sense that the work tasks are either classified or graded differently to your previous job. So what they do is they most of the jobs remain the same level, so the same classification level, but then there are a small number of jobs that are lower classification and a small number of jobs that are higher classification. But the key thing here is that there are less jobs in the new structure. So what that means is that management find and the overall, the net saving for management is that there's less jobs and therefore they save money on staffing costs. But what they do is essentially they make the original workforce redundant and then get people to apply for those jobs in the new organizational structure. And the carrot is that some people will get promoted. So some people will be able to apply for a higher level job. So let's say you were like, HEO or HEW, higher education worker, level 5. In the old structure, it's presented as a career opportunity that you can apply for a HEO 7 or 8 job in the new structure. But of course, the issue is that those jobs are far and few in between, and you have to compete for a job. That's the issue. The other thing is the lower classification roles, obviously, are a result of management taking away some of those tasks and then concentrating them into the higher level jobs. So this has been the main way that staff have been affected in terms of classifications, grading, and therefore salary, as well as the work simplification. The impact on students, I think people can figure out the impact on students. I don't need to spend too much time on it. If you take away your main faculty support person and you place them into a centralized unit where they don't have very much interaction with you, like students previously would come to you at the faculty counter and have like a very human chat and talk to you about anything that was going on in their life. You were often like the main person they spoke to during the day and provided way more than administrative support. Now what happens is it's very difficult to reach the same person. It's a less personalized service. So now there is a centralized phone system. Students have to call to get advice. And the idea of everyone being centralized into the one unit is that they're also supposed to look after other faculty students, so other faculties. So the idea of reorganizing work around a work process rather than a faculty, what that means is you're supposed to learn lots of different faculty processes and lots of different policies and procedures to support not just one faculty like before, but 4 or 5. And that's, supposedly how management get efficiencies out of us. So there have been long phone queues created as a result of centralization and a less personalized service, and generally just a culture of students kind of feeling that it's a degree factory, like not feeling like they're part of, an education system. Like, yeah, it's had a negative impact on students. In terms of the other kind of impact on staff, apart from job security and feeling like you have to learn a million new jobs whilst also being de-skilled, surveillance has been a very, very big issue. So with surveillance, oh my goodness, I've gone for 15 minutes. With surveillance, the way that they have introduced it has been obviously through technology, but also workspaces. So in the faculties, we used to have kind of not necessarily our own office, but a much more humane kind of office with lots of space. With the centralized units, what's happened is we have had workers concentrated into kind of cubicle style, almost like production line offices, open plan offices, with managers sitting in between us all. And that's been the physical kind of surveillance. And then there has been technology to accompany that. So Cisco telephone system, ServiceNow, which is a inquiry management system. Both of these have been ways to manage email inquiries, which give management like higher visibility over what you're doing every day with emails. So previously we would use Outlook, and we still use Outlook, but they are pushing through this kind of technology where if a student sends you an email, rather than you responding as an individual by Outlook, what happens is the email is captured by a ticket inquiry system. So it goes into a portal. Management can see when the email was received, and as soon as the email comes in, a clock starts ticking that is literally ticking the whole time until the inquiry is completed. And so what that means is the worker receives the message that they are being watched. The student has a timer themselves that, oh, your inquiry was submitted this date and this is how long it's taking. And then of course management get a nice dashboard of all the inquiries that are not being answered in time, and they get to, punish staff with around this. Now, okay, so I don't want to sound too negative with it, because obviously these have been major changes in the way our work has been organized. However, there has been one very welcome aspect of this whole process, and that is it has become easier to organize professional staff in these units. The main reason is firstly, it's easier to organize staff who feel like they're working in a satanic mill, to borrow an expression from my colleague. If you feel like you're constantly watched and constantly punished, and just people will not let up, like management won't let up, of course you're more likely to join the union and want to fight. So that's one aspect. But I suppose the other aspect is that if your work is very similar to your colleague, and there's, previously there was one of you in the faculty doing a very bespoke kind of job, and now there's 25 of you in a central unit doing a very similar type of job. Well, if management introduce something like a speed up, or they try to say, oh, you need to finish inquiries within 24 hours instead of 72 hours, then because everyone is experiencing the same kind of grievance, it's easier to organize from that perspective. So I guess just to start winding up, I actually have a lot to say about not just the centralization of services, but the whole trend of, the way Sydney Uni has been restructured. The key thing is, as Nick said, that we need resistance. In a whole bunch of restructures, if the union hasn't taken a strong stance and it has allowed changes to go through, it has been a worse outcome for staff. So I guess the primary thing is drawing a line in the sand and saying, no, these are basic conditions we will never give up, and this is how we're going to organize. And Nick is correct to say that in Australia, we don't have the right to strike, and we also face weak structures in terms of organizationally in the union, etc. But there is actually so much currency and so much value in just creating a culture, a union culture of there is an us and them on this campus. The union who wants a positive vision for universities, and management who want to turn this into a corporation. So even just that basic thing can be extremely mobilizing. And I think seeing it as a way of building long-term industrial power and using every single injustice as an organizing opportunity, as a way to demonstrate to staff why the boss is not your friend, why the introduction of this technology is not here to help services, it's here to help spying or surveillance of staff, why efficiencies don't mean anything to staff, they're to the detriment of staff. All of these things, building up a union culture, are super important for the long term. And I suppose that's the main thing, that we want to use every single injustice as a way to organize staff and win people to the idea that when you become a union member, you become a union activist. But then also when you become a union activist, it's basically for life. Or until the revolution, really, until we get rid of this fraud system. Yeah, so I think I'll just leave it there because I've gone over time, but I would really love to talk a lot more about everything that's happened at UC, but also I'm curious to hear about things happening at Alberta, especially organizing efforts. But I'll just leave it there because I've gone over time. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that, Alma. I've been busily taking notes. I'm sure everybody else has been busily taking notes. And it is so valuable to us to be hearing directly from you about these types of impacts and how it has impacted work at the University of Sydney. And when our administration is taking USydney as their model, how that may unfold for us here. And quite frightening, some of your examples as well. So I just want to make a note about privacy and make sure everybody is aware that this session is being recorded. So if you do unmute your mic, you're consenting to being recorded. We have over 300 people on the call. So if you are posting on the chat box, all of those people can see what you're posting. So be aware of that. But if you have a burning question and you don't want your name attached to it, please send it as a private message in the chat to either myself or Ricardo, and then we can ask your question without your name being attached to it. So I've been watching the chat as best I can. Lots of interesting comments going through there, and I want to pull one of the questions that I saw go by already out and ask that of our guests, and then I'll check in with Ricardo if he has a burning question, and then I'll go over to the chat box again, either questions that are going up for everyone to see or ones that are coming directly to me, and asking more questions, because as I already said, it's so valuable to be hearing directly from people who have been experiencing this firsthand. So the question that I noted going by, and it's one that I've been concerned about as well, is the impact of the uniform data on the restructuring. So if either Nick or Alma would be able to comment on that, because I know I've heard from a lot of NASA members that they're quite concerned about that the uniform data is just simply bad data, that people are filling it out differently in different departments. It was part of the comment, and it scrolled up on the chat there, but they were saying how that the people doing the work in their area weren't even necessarily the people filling out the uniform data. And I've also been concerned that how it captures data and that very transactional analysis really doesn't even measure a lot of the work that's currently happening across our campus. So if Nick or Alma could comment on the issue of how the uniform data is being used or has been used in the restructure at USydney.
Alma, do you want to say something about that, or?
I actually don't know much about the uniform data. You?
I mean, yeah, I don't either. But what I can say perhaps is that, you know, characteristically we find that the data that management predicate restructure plans on turns out to be wrong, and that's sort of easy for us, I think, because it's easy to, or easy enough to collect objective data that's been assembled on fairly, you know, methodologically on a methodologically sound basis and just counterpose it to the figures that management have. I mean, at the moment at our university, and actually quite widely in Australia, graduate workers or casualised academic staff who are a particularly exploited part of the workforce have been presenting a whole lot of, have been doing a whole lot of their own data gathering about the actual hours they work versus the hours that they're formally paid for. And that has had a whole lot of traction, both on campus and in the media outside it. So that's an example of the way in which, you know, presenting a sort of set of counter data can really play into unions' hands. And I think that's the obvious thing to do, is to collect, disseminate, and campaign around objective sets of data, because that also, of course, has the advantage of undermining confidence in management, which is obviously what we want to be doing.
So yeah, I think collecting the counter data is a really good suggestion for us, and something that we need to take to heart for sure. So I'm going to just go to Ricardo now and see, Ricardo, do you have a burning question from the past hour?
I think, I mean, it's not so much a burning ask, but more of an observation with maybe a question at the end. And it's like the observation is frightening. It's like looking down the tracks and seeing what's coming at us. Everything from the rationale for the restructuring, Alma, the language that we're hearing around what they want to do with administration is exactly pointing to what you just documented and told us about. So it's all of that, plus a government that's very focused on austerity, a government that's in the process of clawing back union rights and how we organize and how we mobilize and all of those things. I mean, it paints a very ominous picture. And one of the things that struck me that maybe I could get your comments on, both of you, is that it seems that in terms of, you know, kind of overall academic integrity, the quality of teaching, quality of research, it seems like the administrative side of the reorganization had potentially as much, if not more, impact on the kind of academic functioning of the school than the actual academic reorganization did. Is that, like, am I getting that right?
Can I chip in?
Go ahead, Alma.
Yes, that is an excellent observation, because in an effort to save administration costs, they actually changed a whole bunch of policies that the university is supposed to abide by to support courses, etc. So, for example, the HDR administration rule, it's like the course resolutions for postgraduate research students. They rewrote it so that it's more efficient to carry out a thesis examination, for example. They shortened the time that's allowed to carry out a thesis examination. A whole bunch of courses they simplified meaning they got rid of a whole bunch of majors or units of study. And the justification is, of course, that, you know, they're too complex for students to understand and for, you know, people to, you know, weave through, etc. And so, of course, this has an impact on the academic quality that's being delivered. One of the most recent changes has been, and I'm still like shocked from this, is we used to have 3 examiners for a PhD thesis. Now it's 2. You know, it's just like, so it's basically 1 less person scrutinizing a PhD thesis. We used to give examiners about 3 months to examine a thesis. Now we give them 6 weeks. You know, and did PhD theses get easier to examine? No, of course not. But it's just a quicker way to push through, you know, a graduation, basically. So yes, there has been a lot of these administration changes have had an impact on the academic service quality and side of things. Yeah.
Anything to add there, Nick, or should I go on to the next question? I've got.
Well, I suppose just very quickly, Elizabeth, just to say that even if the impact of the big restructure was largely organisational, the general spirit that motivated it has, had a terrible effect on academic quality, in the sense that, there are fewer academic staff, there are more precariously employed academic staff. Our university's staff-student ratio, for example, is particularly low when you compare it to comparably ranked institutions. When people leave the university, they're not replaced. So there's a very determined campaign underway against security in academic work, and a bid to make the workforce continually more precarious, continually less secure, and that's what's affecting our academic quality more than anything else.
Folks, I have to tell you how much I love being in the university environment, because there was some chatter in the chat about Dickens, and an English prof jumped in to make sure everyone knew that dark satanic mills was coined by the radical poet William Blake, who would have fought this process harder than Dickens would have. So it's great to have that kind of comment. There was a question that I received about libraries. And so Nick and Alma, would either of you have information about how the restructure impacted the libraries specifically on your campus?
I know we both do, because we talked about it last night. So Alma, do you want to?
You go first, Nick, and I'll fill in.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, obviously the library is sort of, privileged target for neoliberal austerity reforms, because it's a sort of quintessential repository of knowledge, which, most of the books there are used fairly rarely, but they have to be there. It's a place where people can come and sit and study in a way that's not obviously tied to any sort of prominent or very clear sort of immediate utilitarian goal. It evokes images of a traditional sort of understanding of what scholarship and knowledge creation are. So it's obviously bears the brunt of management hate it, basically. And indeed, at our library, which was once a very large, very good library, management, under the cover of operational health and safety measures, voided the library of a very large proportion of its books, which they transferred to an off-site storage facility a very long way away. So you now have to order in a book from storage. Very often it takes 2 or 3 days to come in. They undertook a very aggressive set of changes to staffing at the library, involving job cuts and also involving a sort of McDonaldization of library staff's role, so that library staff were going to be forced to wear uniforms, and we're going to, instead of being able to sit behind desks to issue books and to answer inquiries and help students with their bibliographical research, they were meant to take, tablets and roam, at large around the library, just waiting for people to come and approach them. Fortunately, we stopped that. We did stop that and we stopped that particular part of it even before we had got a campaign underway in the university more widely. I mean, Alma and I were just remembering last night how we were on the point of rolling out some posters which were going to show a librarian handing over a book with the words, would you like fries with that, to try and highlight the McDonaldization of these roles. And we didn't have to, because I think there was such internal resistance among the library staff themselves, both to the sort of increasingly, demeaning and Taylorist kind of positions that they were going to be put into, and to the cuts among their colleagues, which did go ahead. But, you know, we had some limited success in that campaign. Alma, I don't know, you no doubt have stuff to add to that.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. One, I just can't resist but share this with people. One bit about the library restructure was, so we had a campaign, and it went for close to 2 years actually, because although we weren't able to necessarily stop every part of the corporatization of the library, there were bits where we challenged it and won. And also just managed to drag it out for management. And I'm not sure how our enterprise agreement or our collective agreement compares to the University of Alberta one, but a major thing we have is change management clauses which force management to consult with the unions and the staff. And so we use those change management clauses as a way of, you know, challenging their plans and delaying them. And that allows us to basically buy time so we can organize the public campaigning. Because the public and political campaigning is just as important, if not more important, than all the legal challenges. And by the way, if those change management clauses don't exist in your current agreement, well, I think that's just another argument for striking really hard next time you can to win them, basically. In 2013 and 2017, we had strikes at Sydney University, and change management and job security were one of our major kind of claims. But back to the library one, Nick said that they tried to introduce uniforms at the library. And the local delegates there did a survey of attitudes to wearing a uniform, to basically how do staff feel. And they received this submission from one of the staff members, which I just thought was too good not to share. So they said, I suggest tastefully branded vests or jackets that can be put over staff's normal clothes, not cheap tacky t-shirts, and that this should be a choice for staff if they wish, but not compulsory if they choose not to wear it. Lanyards are a dehumanizing and tasteless corporate abomination. Better a nice flash jacket or loose vest. Black, maybe, but nothing too fascistically Hugo Boss in style. No military style epaulets, except maybe for my library management. That was I'll post the full quote in the chat, but that was one of the survey responses to staff being asked, would you like to wear a uniform in the library? And I think it's just a really good example of, even if you don't win every single fight, the kind of spirit of resistance that it creates in staff, and sort of the deep-seated hatred of corporatism and management that it sows, is actually super, super important for building long-term industrial power and organizing capabilities. Yeah, I'll just leave it there.
Okay, great. I think that those were some really good examples because it captured some of the real underlying issues of what we're facing. But I know there's quite a few questions, and we could probably go on for another couple of hours, but I'm going to try to get to as many of them as I can. So maybe Nick and Alma, you can keep your answers fairly short. There is someone who wants to know from Alma, if you could go back in time, knowing what you know now, is there anything that you think would help get better outcomes, and maybe a couple of quick examples of resistance, things that worked?
Yes, so going back in time, I mean, I think this is why I started my talk with, it is really important for the union as a whole to be combative about these kind of restructures, because unfortunately a lot of stuff was allowed to happen because I suppose the union felt defensive about change in the workplace, kind of feeling like they had to comply with management, or management has a right to manage, they're in charge, etc. So I suppose the first thing would be that there should have been way bigger resistance on part of the union, and we should have threatened strikes really in a whole bunch of these places. But in terms of what kind of stuff has worked, probably a really significant thing that I didn't get to mention in my talk was the fight in my department against KPIs. So when they introduced this Cisco phone system, which is basically not your average phone. It's not just an office phone that you pick up a phone call from a student and you answer their inquiry like a human being and you hang up and that's the end of it. The Cisco phone system is a way that management sees exactly what you're doing on a dashboard. It times your phone call, and it also is attached to a queue system. So if a student calls a central number, it goes into a queue, and then lots of people can see how many phone calls there are in the queue, etc. Now, this introduction of this phone system was also attached to the introduction of the inquiry management system that I mentioned before, which turns the simple task of answering an email from a student into this full-on analysis of your productivity. Now, when this happened, when they tried to introduce this in my department, basically they tried to attach it to metrics, or another way of saying it is unrealistic KPIs or key performance indicators. And my department was the only department that actually resisted this and won. And I simply attribute that to kicking up a major fuss and basically being a radical, because most other departments accept the idea that it's reasonable for management to give workers a set of tasks and a time limit on how long it takes to complete the task. Whereas in my department, and I was key to organizing this, I was just furious at the idea that they would be timing our interactions with students and that they would dehumanize us to the point of measuring every single thing we did literally to the last second, and then putting that on our performance reviews, and then basically having your numbers reviewed every 6 months. So we kicked up a fuss in my department. We organized we organized several union meetings, created a full-on crisis for management. We took every single legal challenge we could. So we disputed it internally. We took it to our external kind of industrial relations commission called the Fair Work Commission. But the most important thing was we had solid 100% opposition to the introduction of KPIs. And we fought it on kind of political and moral grounds, i.e. we are not robots. We don't want to be dehumanized to this point. And we just created a situation where management couldn't have a staff meeting because they would just get attacked by all these angry union members, demanding to be treated like humans basically and not robots. So we won that. And then the victory in my department was later generalized to the student center, which is basically traditionally in the last 5 years has been the Satanic Mill. And so it's quite a significant victory, and it's significant because it's in the law. Management can do this. And also we didn't go on strike over this, but we created enough of a campaign, enough of a fight that they just backed away on that. So I suppose the real lesson there is to just take a stand and not accept everything that's dealt out, even if you don't have a legal standing. There are lots of political ways to argue to retain kind of workers' rights and conditions in the workplace. But yeah, I suppose overall, it's got to be the union draws a line and they, organize a fight and see how far you get. And if there's limits in the collective agreement, well, then you strike over those conditions the next time you can, and then you win a better agreement. So it's kind of like seeing things as a long-term thing. Yeah.
Thanks, Alma. I'm going to kind of ask a couple at the same time, and you can maybe speak to pieces of them. And I have a question. Somebody is asking about how do we deconstruct the university administration's reasons for the cuts, such as in quotation marks, temporary, the COVID-19 situation. And they're concerned that the support staff model in Australia appears to be like that found in call centers with penalties for slightly exceeding benchmarks. And then there's a question about how in these restructuring, how was middle management restructured? And then also about the students. How have students responded, and how can we engage students to be more aware of the impacts to them? Maybe we'll go to Nick to see if you can give some feedback on those questions.
Okay, sure. Thanks, Elizabeth. I can certainly say something about the first one and the last one. So maybe to take students first. In all of the political struggles that we have on campus, student support is absolutely vital. I think I can say that the union would be just infinitely less effective as a campaigning organisation if we didn't work closely together with student organisations, the Student Representative Council, the Postgraduate Representative Association. You know, students are a lot more militant than middle-class professionals are, like academics and most professional workers. And for that reason, allying with them is just absolutely central. And, you know, at the moment at the University of Sydney, it's really the students who are generating the most prominent resistance to the latest tranche of austerity measures that's bearing down on us. They're the ones who are defying the police mostly to have demonstrations against the public, you know, despite the public health orders, which are being spuriously used to stop people demonstrating on campus against job cuts and so on. So student involvement is absolutely crucial, I would say. And students can perceive very, very easily that the kinds of restructures that university managements want to put through characteristically are bad for them in the ways that Alma in particular has been describing, and also in terms of, you know, the consequences for class size, the consequences for diversity of course offerings and all of that stuff. On the reasons that, and deconstructing management's narrative, you know, I think the important thing here is just to offer a very consistent and determined counter narrative. And I don't know whether, maybe I'll just put this in the chat. One thing that we have done in our branch at the university, though not as much as I myself would have liked to, is to publish, over the last couple of years, we've published a counter report that the union has brought out into the university. And I can't actually now find the link to that I had prepared before, so I won't be posting it in the chat. But perhaps I can just very quickly share a screen. Can I do that? You can let me do that. So that's the front cover of the most recent counter report that we published in 2017, and this was quite a long document. Which you can find on the internet, quite a long document, which was collectively authored by colleagues from around the university, including precariously employed colleagues, where we did things like give a detailed sort of financial and political, we presented a financial and political, account of where the university stands. And at length made the kinds of arguments that we need to make in order to defend our vision of the university against management. So typically in these situations, we have the best arguments. That's never been a political problem that we've had in the union, finding the right arguments. We always have the best arguments because management are determined to corporatize, to, degrade the educational experience, to make working conditions worse. So the arguments are not hard to find. And bursting the efficiency bubble is certainly, you know, an easy thing to do, because the things management want to do are typically, they may, under some perverse notion of efficiency, make things more efficient, but they also make them worse in all sorts of other really important parameters. And it just suffices to point that out mostly, I think, to be able to galvanize, you know, opposition around them and create a really solid consensus on campus.
That's great. And I think, like you answered with that, one of the other questions that I saw going by with your comment about bursting the efficiency bubble, because there's a lot of this language about efficiency, and sometimes it feels overpowering to try to fight back against that. But your comments about being able to burst that are really good. I'm noticing that we are at 5 minutes to 6, and we had scheduled this until 6, and so I don't know, Nick and Alma, whether you're able to stay at all past that, but I'm sure there are some folks on the call who aren't able to stay any later. So I do just want to, if you're able to stay a little bit, we may be able to get to a few other questions, but for those that have to leave, I want everybody to hear me thanking Nick and Alma profusely for sharing this information with us. And thank you to NASA and our, thank you to Ricardo and our AJUA colleagues, and to Cole, who's our NASA staff person who did all the organization and background on this, because we really appreciate all the work everybody has put in. And also that I've been seeing comments in the chat about they would like to see NASA and AJUA be following your examples from Sydney and some of the work that you've done. So we're hearing that from you folks. And I'll just give Ricardo a chance to say a word or two to close things off as well. Over to you, Ricardo.
Yeah, just to extend my thanks again to Nick and Alma for the amazing presentations, expressions of solidarity, and for bringing us a kind of degree of radicalness and militancy that we don't often encounter in our circles here in Alberta. So thank you so much for that. To those of us who are asking what's next, stay posted. Elizabeth and I will stay in contact. ASUA and NASA will dig into the mountains of information that were sent out by administration today, find where we can draw those lines, and start engaging all of you about ways that we can start pushing back. So thank you again to everybody for attending.